Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Office Hours Politics Edition. I'm your host, Sienna Ali, and today we're talking about something that we never actually talk about and never really question. We are talking about the international system. We typically talk about it in classrooms or lectures as if it's just there, as if it's neutral, as if it's natural. We say things like the international community, international law, global norms, a rule-based order. Like there are objective truths rather than political decisions made by specific actors at specific moments in history for specific reasons. But here's the truth. The international system was built, it was designed, and it was designed by people with power. Obviously, it did not emerge peacefully, it did not emerge fairly, and it certainly did not emerge equally. This is a system that was forged through war, empire, colonial expansion, capital accumulation, and violence, and its structure still reflects those origins today. So when people ask, why does international law seem selective? Why do some states get veto power over war and peace? Why are borders treated as sacred even when they were violently imposed? Why do some countries get sanctions while others get immunity? The answer isn't the system is failing. The answer is the system is working as designed. In this episode, we are going to do something a little ambitious. We are going to strip the international system down to its foundations. We're going to ask what existed before these systems. Why did these modern states become the dominant unit of global politics? How did European ideas become global rules? And what assumptions about power, sovereignty, legitimacy were baked into the system from the very beginning? Now, this episode is not about memorizing treaties or dates. It's about understanding how the world was organized and why. That's the kicker. Once you start understanding how the system was built, you will start to see why it protects some lives more than others, why some violence is condemned while other violence is normalized, and why change within the system is so difficult. So before we talk about the United Nations, international law, global governance, we need to rewind way back to a time before borders look the way they do now, before sovereignty meant what it means today, and before the modern international system even existed. Let's get into it. So, before the international system, we had something very different. And this is important because modern systems didn't replace chaos. It replaced other systems. For most of human history, the world was not organized around independent, sovereign nation states. There were no embassies as we understand them, no passports, no fixed borders recognized by international law, no assumptions that all political units were equal. Instead, political life was organized through empire, religion, dynastic rule, and a hierarchy of authority. Power was layered, overlapping, and unequal by design. Let's start with empires. Empires, not states. Empires were the dominant form of political organization for centuries. Think of the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Qing dynasty. These were not states in the modern sense. They did not claim absolute control over a neatly bordered territory with uniform laws applied equally to all people. In imperial China, political order was structured around a tribute system, where neighboring regions acknowledged Chinese supremacy in exchange for trade and protection. What mattered wasn't sovereignty, it was hierarchy. Who owed loyalty to whom? Who paid tribute? Who had legitimacy? And crucially, empire did not require equality to function. Another thing we take for granted today is borders. We imagine borders as fixed and permanent. This is a very modern idea. In pre-modern political systems, borders were ambitious, constantly shifting. Authority faded gradually rather than stopping at a hard line. A ruler's influence weakened the farther you moved from the center. There was no expectations that borders perfectly defined identity, loyalty, or law. The idea that crossing a line would make you an illegal person would have been absurd. Now, before the modern state, religion was not separate from politics. I mean, I would argue that religion does impact modern politics, but we just pretend it doesn't. Anyways, I digress. Religion was politics back then. In medieval Europe, authority flowed from divine legitimacy. Kings ruled by God's will. Law was tied to theology. And this is something that we discussed in our revolution episode. Similarly, in Islamic governance, Political authority was intertwined with religious legitimacy, jurisprudence, and moral responsibility, not territorial sovereignty in the modern sense. What mattered was moral authority, communal obligation, and legitimacy grounded in belief, not abstract legal equality between political units. There was no international law as we understand it today. There were treaties, customs, norms, and diplomatic practices. But they were not universal and they were not enforced equally. Power determined whose rules mattered. Strong empires imposed norms. Weaker states, if you will, adapted or resisted. There was no illusion of neutrality, no claim that all political entities were formed equally. And that is important because in the modern international system, we would later claim equality while reproducing a hierarchy in a subtler way. So the key takeaways of before the modern international system were there were empires, not sovereign states. Authority was a hierarchy. Borders were flexible. Laws were customary, and power was explicit. The world was unequal, but it was honest about that inequality. The modern system would do something different. It would promise equality, sovereignty, and neutrality while embedding power into its foundations. And that transition didn't happen peacefully. It happened through war. When political science textbooks talk about the origins of modern international system, they usually point to one moment, one year, one event, 1648. The year the 30-Year War ended. The year the Treaty of Westphalia was signed. And supposedly the year the modern world was born. This moment is often treated as a clean break, a neat transition from chaos to order, but that story is misleading because the modern international system was not born out of peace. It was born out of exhaustion, violence, and political necessity. To understand why Westphalia mattered and why it's often mythologized, we need to understand the war that came before it. The 30-Year War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648, devastated Central Europe. Entire regions were destroyed, cities emptied. Famine and disease followed armies wherever they went. This was not just a religious war between Catholics and Protestants. It was a political crisis about authority. Who had the right to rule? Who could decide religion? Who had legitimate power over territory? At the time, Europe was organized around overlapping authorities: the Catholic Church, emperors, kings, princes. Power was layered and ambiguous, and that ambiguity became deadly. The war made something clear to Europe's rulers. The system was no longer suitable. The Treaty of Westphalia was not designed to create global equality. It was designed to stop Europeans from killing each other. And it did so by introducing 3 ideas that would later define the international system. The first idea was territorial sovereignty. Westphalia formalized the idea that political authority belongs to rulers within defined territories, not to the emperors above them, not to religious institutions outside of them. Each ruler would govern their territory without external interference. This is the birth of sovereignty as we understand it today. A state would have supreme authority inside its borders, no higher political authority above it. This sounds neutral. This sounds even fair. But sovereignty did not emerge as a moral principle. It emerged as a pragmatic compromise among powerful actors. The second principle was non-interference. States agreed to not intervene in each other's internal affairs, especially religion. Again, this was not about peace in the abstract. It was about survival. Intervention had become too costly, and importantly, non-interference applied selectively, even from the start. It was a rule for European powers, not a universal norm. The third principle was the idea that states were legally equal, not militarily equal, not economically equal, but formally under emerging international norms equal. And this is where modern states make its most powerful promise, that all states, regardless of size or strength, are equal. So obviously we're starting to lie now, because equality on paper would coexist with the massive inequality in reality. Here's the critical point. Westphalia did not instantly create modern international systems. It didn't include colonies, non-European societies, and most of the world. What it did was it normalized a European way of organizing power, and that model would later be imposed globally. Westphalia was not global. It was provincial, but it would become universal through empire. And this new political order emerged. Thinkers began to theorize it, and one of the most influential was Thomas Hobbes. You can literally skip these next few seconds when I talk big political philosophy if you watch my other episodes where I've talked about it intensely. Anyways, Thomas Hobbes argued that without a strong authority, society would collapse into chaos, a state of nature defined by fear and violence. His solution: a powerful sovereign, or a leviathan, order over morality, security over freedom. And this logic would deeply influence how states justified power, both internally and internationally. Then comes John Locke. This guy justified so much colonialism. It is insane. He emphasized property, consent, and limited government. But again, his ideas about property would later justify colonial dispossession. Land was not properly used by European standards and was then treated as available. And finally, Rousseau enters the chat. Rousseau focused on legitimacy, not just power, but whether authority was justified. And these ideas helped shape nationalism, popular sovereignty, and the belief that states represent people, even when they don't. Now, here's the most important thing you need to understand about post-Westphalian system. Sovereignty was not universal. European states recognized sovereignty among themselves while denying it everywhere else. Colonies were not sovereign. Indigenous people were not sovereign. Non-European societies were governed, not recognized. This system was inclusive by promise, but exclusive in practice. This contradiction sits at the heart of international politics to this day. After Westphalia, one political unit rises above all others: the state. Not empires, not religious communities, not people, states. This matters because once the state becomes the primary actor, borders matter more than lives, recognition matters more than justice, legality matters more than legitimacy. The system stops asking, is this rule moral? They start asking, is this rule recognized? So, the key takeaway from Westphalia didn't create peace. It created a framework for magnifying conflict, and that framework privileges territorial authority, normalizes non-interference, claims equality, while embedding hierarchy. And most importantly, it created a system that could be exported through conquest, colonialism, and force. And then this next part, we are going to follow that export. The international system did not spread through consensus. It spread through colonial domination. Up to this point of the story, the international system has been almost entirely European. European wars, European treaties, European political theory, and that is not an accident, because the modern international system did not become international through mutual agreement. It became international through empire. What began as a regional European agreement, sovereignty, borders, legal equity, was exported to the rest of the world through colonial domination. And that export fundamentally shaped how the system works today. By the 18th and 19th centuries, European powers were expanded outward at an unprecedented scale. Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, later Germany, Belgium, and Italy. This expansion was not just about territory, it was about controlling trade routes, extracting resources, accumulating capital, and restructuring societies to serve imperial economies. The international system became global because Europe made it global, and it did so on unequal terms. Here's the key contradiction. Colonial territories were governed through the international system, but they were never treated as full members of it. They were ruled, administrated, taxed, exploited, but not recognized as sovereign. European powers claimed sovereignty for themselves while denying it elsewhere. And this wasn't a flaw in the system, it was a feature of its design. Now, to justify this contradiction, empire relied on ideology. Colonialism was framed not as domination, but as duty through the civilizing mission, something I feel very passionately about. European powers claimed they were bringing law, order, reason, civilization to supposedly backward society. backwards being people of color, backwards being non-European. This narrative did enormous political work. It allowed empire to present violence as benevolence, disposition as development, domination as progress, and it embedded racial hierarchy directly into the logic of international order. And the international system did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged alongside scientific racism, race classification, and hierarchies of humanity. Non-European societies were often described as incapable of self-rule, politically immature, culturally inferior. This mattered because sovereignty was increasingly tied to recognition, and recognition depended on meeting European standards of civilization. If you were not recognized, you were not sovereign. If you were not sovereign, anything could be done to you. One of the clearest examples of this logic is the Berlin Conference. European powers met to divide Africa among themselves. No African leaders were invited. No African consent was sought. Borders were drawn with rulers on maps, often splitting communities, languages, and histories apart. These borders would later become internationally recognized state boundaries, and they would generate instability, conflict, and violence that continues to this day. This is not ancient history. This is the architecture of the modern world. International law expanded during this period, but not as a neutral force. It was used to regulate competition between empires, legitimize territorial claims, protect European interests abroad. Colonial violence was often legal. Resistance was criminalized, and law didn't restrain empire, it enabled it. At the same time, the international system became deeply intertwined with capitalism. Colonies were reorganized to serve global markets. Cash crops replaced subsistence farming. Local economies were reshaped around export. Labor was coerced, cheapened, or enslaved. The global economy became a hierarchy. Industrial centers in Europe, extraction zones elsewhere. Political sovereignty and economic dependency became deeply linked. Many states would later become independent but remain economically constrained. By the late 19th century, sovereignty was no longer just about territory. It was about economic organization, political institutions, conformity to European norms. And this is where the idea of conditional sovereignty begins. Some states were fully sovereign. Others were supervised, controlled, or managed. And this logic still exists today, just under different language. By the time the 20th century began, the international system is global, but it is not equal. It is, again, a hierarchy. It's racialized, it's capitalist, it's imperial. And this structure doesn't disappear when colonialism formally ends. It carries forward into mandates, into development regimes, into international institutions. Decolonization will challenge empire, but it will not dismantle the system empire built. The key takeaway from this section would be the international system did not spread because it was universally accepted. It spread because it was enforced through conquest, law, economic power, and racial hierarchy. And by the time much of the world gained formal independence, the rules had already been written, the ink dried. And in this next part, we are going to look at how the first attempt at global governance tries and fails and resolves these contradictions. Because the 20th century doesn't reject empire, it reorganizes it. By the early 20th century, the contradictions of the international system were no longer containable. Empire had gone global. Capitalism had linked economies across continents. Nationalism has intensified, and the balance of power that once stabilized Europe had begun to fail. The result? World War I. A war so destructive that it shattered the illusion that the existing system could manage conflict indefinitely. This was not just a war between states, it was a crisis of global order. World War I exposed the fragility of the international system built on sovereignty, alliances, and power politics. States were formally equal, but militarily and economically they were not. Alliance commitments dragged countries into war. Hero rivalries escalated. Colonial subjects were mobilized to fight wars they had no say in. By 1918, millions were dead, empires had collapsed, Europe was economically devastated. The old order had failed. And for the first time, political leaders openly asked a radical question. What if war itself could be prevented, not just managed? This is where liberal idealism, out of this devastation, emerged a new vision, a belief that transparency could replace secret alliances, law could replace force, institutions could replace empire. This vision is often called imperial internationalism. Its most famous advocate was Wilson. Wilson's 14 points promised self-determination, open diplomacy, collective security. The language was revolutionary. For the first time, global order was framed not just as a balance of power, but as a moral project. This vision materialized in the League of Nations. The League was the first permanent international organization designed to prevent war, resolve disputes peacefully, enforce collective security. It represented a fundamental shift, the idea that war was not inevitable, that it could be outlawed. But the League carried fatal contradictions from birth. First, the League had no enforcement power. It could condemn aggression, but it couldn't stop it. There was no standing military, no binding authority over sovereign states, and critically, major powers undermined it from the start. The United States, the very country that proposed it, never joined. Other powers participated selectively. The League depended on the goodwill of states, the very thing the system was supposed to transcend. The second was the promise of self-determination and that it was applied selectively. European empires collapsed, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, new states emerged in Europe, but colonized peoples elsewhere were denied independence. Instead, they were placed under the mandate system. The mandate system claimed that colonial societies were not ready for self-rule. They needed guidance, supervision, development. Former colonies were reclassified as mandates administered by European powers. In practice, this was empire renamed. Borders were drawn, again, without consent. Political authority remained external. Resistance was suppressed. The system preserved imperial control while pretending to move beyond it. One of the most consequential mandates was Palestine. Administrated by Britain, Palestine became a site where imperial interests, national movements, and international promises collided. The international system did not resolve competing claims, it institutionalized them. This pattern would repeat across the global south. By the 30s, the League's weakness was undeniable. Italy invaded Ethiopia. Germany rearmed and expanded. The League condemned, but did nothing. Powerful states ignored rules when it suited them. Weaker states paid the price. The lesson was brutal. Institutions without power cannot restrain power. The League did not fail because people lacked good intentions. It failed because sovereignty still trumped law. Empire still trumped the system, and power remained uneven. The system tried to impose morality on a structure built for dominance, and the contradiction proved fatal. The key takeaway here: the League of Nations was a turning point. It introduced global governance, collective security, and international cooperation, but it also revealed the limits of idealism within an unequal system. The international order could not simply wish away empire, hierarchy, and power. And when the League failed, the world paid the price. Because its collapse did not lead to reform, it led to something worse: World War II. By the end of World War II, there was no ambiguity left. The international system failed twice. World War I exposed the weaknesses of the balance of power politics. World War II exposed the catastrophic consequences of not fixing them. The scale of destruction made one thing very clear: there could not be another war like this. So the question facing world leaders in 1945 was not idealistic, it was practical. How do we build an international system strong enough to prevent total war without threatening the sovereignty of powerful states? The answer would shape the modern world. The system built after World War II rests on a fundamental bargain. Powerful states agree to restraint, but only if their power was formally recognized and protected. This is key to understanding the modern institutions. This is not egalitarian, it is stabilizing. and stability was prioritized over justice. In 1945, 50 countries signed the Charter of the United Nations. The UN was designed to succeed where the League of Nations failed. This time, membership would be bordered, institutions would be permanent, enforcement would be real. But the most important design choice was power would not be denied. It would be institutionalized. At the heart of the UN is the Security Council, 5 permanent members: United States, United Kingdom, France, the Soviet Union, now Russia, and China. These states were given veto power. They could block any substantive resolution. This was not an accident. This was not hypocrisy. It was, if you know what it was just insane, because we see the consequences of these veto powers, especially the United States' veto power, play out in modern reality as we speak. But the lesson of the League of Nations was clear. If powerful states are not protected, they will ignore the system entirely. So the UN embeds inequality to preserve participation. The system sacrifices formal equality for survival. The UN Charter reaffirms sovereignty but redefines its limits. States are sovereign, yes, but aggression is prohibited, war must be justified, intervention is regulated. In theory, this is a profound shift. In practice, enforcement remains selective. Sovereignty becomes conditional, depending on power, alliances, and geopolitics. Now, one of the most significant inventions of the post-war order is the introduction of human rights as an international concern. Human rights challenged absolute sovereignty, but again, it depended on politics. Rights exist on paper, not so much in practice. Now, while the UN addressed security, another set of institutions addressed the economy. Delegates met at Bretton Woods to design a global economic order. The result was the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, later joined by the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, eventually the World Trade Order. These institutions were designed to stabilize currencies, promote reconstruction, and facilitate trade. But they also embedded U.S. dominance into global economy. The dollar became the reserve currency. Economic governance reflected Western priorities. Political independence did not mean economic autonomy. After 1948, empire begins to formally collapse. Dozens of new states emerge across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. But these states enter a system they did not design. Rules already exist. Institutions already exist. The power hierarchy already set. New states gain flags and seats, but limited influence. And this is where post-colonial inequality becomes institutionalized. The system is universal in membership, but unequal in authority. Almost immediately, the international system becomes shaped by the Cold War. 2 blocks, 2 ideologies, permanent tensions. The UN becomes less a tool of collective security and more a stage for geopolitical competition. Vetoes paralyze action. Allies are protected. Violence is tolerated when strategically useful. The system prevents total war, but permits endless smaller ones. By the end of the period, the international system had a clear structure. It includes sovereign states, international law, global institutions, economic governance, security hierarchies, and it operates on one central principle. Stability comes before justice. Peace is maintained and inequality is preserved. Conflict is managed, not resolved. So the key takeaway is the international system built after World War II was not broken. It was incredibly successful at what it was designed to do: prevent great power war, stabilize global order, manage competition. It was never designed to dismantle empire, equalize power, and deliver universal justice. And that tension defines global politics today. Now, in this last part, we are going to step back and ask, what does this system actually include? What theories explain how it works? And can a system built on hierarchy ever deliver genuine global justice? Because understanding the system is the first step towards challenging it. Now, at this point in the episode, we have stopped treating the international system like a mystery, and we have started treating it like a historical construction. We've seen how it emerged from European war, imperial expansion, colonial domination, capitalist integration, and elite bargaining after massive violence. So in this final part, we're going to ask a few questions. At its core, the international system is made up of states. States as primary actors, not people, not communities, not movements, states. And this is the first and most important design choice. The system recognizes governments, not justice. If a government is recognized, it matters. If it isn't, it doesn't. And that is why borders are protected even when unjust. Regime matters more than populations. Legality overrides legitimacy. Beyond states, the system includes international institutions, international law, norms and rules, economic governance structures, security agreements. All of these claim neutrality. None of them are neutral. They reflect power relations that created them. Now let's talk theory. Not just because I love theory, but because theory explains how power works. Different theories don't just describe the world, they tell us what is reasonable and what we should expect from it. The oldest and most influential theory is realism. Realism starts from a simple assumption. There is no higher authority above states. The international system is archaic, but we have discussed that on previous episodes. But from this perspective, war is normal, competition is inevitable, and morality is secondary. Realism doesn't ask, is this just? It asks, is this effective? Much of the international system behaves exactly as realism predicts. Selective enforcement, Security Council vetoes, permanent inequality. Realism doesn't justify the system, it explains why it persists. Liberal internationalism takes a more optimistic view. It argues that institutions reduce conflict. Cooperation is possible, rules can shape behavior. This is the logic behind international law, human rights regimes, and multilateral organizations. Liberalism believes that the system can be improved from within, but it often underestimates power. Institutions only work when powerful states allow them to. Rules matter until they don't. Critical theorists shift the focus. They ask, who benefits? From this perspective, the international system is not just political, it's economic. States don't just compete for security, they compete for markets, resources, labor, capital. Global inequality is not accidental, it's structural, because the system protects property, investment, and capital flows, while treating poverty, exploitation, and dependency as unfortunate side effects. And post-colonial theory goes even further. It argues that the international system is not just unequal, it's colonial in origin and structure. The system universalizes European norms, marginalizes non-European political traditions, and treated some lives as more valuable than others. Sovereignty was granted selectively. Recognition was conditional. Violence was normalized in the global south. From this view, today's crises are not anomalies, they're continuations. This brings us to the hard truth. The international system is incredibly resistant to change. Why? Because power is so concentrated. Rules protect those with influence. Reforms threaten stability. The system prioritizes order over justice. It can absorb criticism, it can adapt language, but it rarely redistributes power. This is why calls for reform often stall. Not because change is impossible, because it's very threatening to those who have the power. Those that can make the change will never. This is where the moment where everything clicks. When the UN fails to stop war, when the international law is selectively enforced, when borders matter more than people, it's not failure, it was design. Expecting reform without transformation is a category error. So what do we do with this knowledge? Understanding the system doesn't mean cynicism. It means clarity. It means knowing when institutions are tools and when they are obstacles. It means recognizing that real change often comes from pressure, movements, resistance, norm shifting, and political struggle, not just legal reform. International system is not destiny. It is history, and history can be challenged. The rules of the world were written by power, but they were written by people. And what people build can be dismantled, rewritten, and reimagined, but only if they understand what they're up against. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. Next time you hear the international community has spoken, international rules require, the rule-based order demands, you better ask yourself, who wrote them? Who benefits from them? Who pays the price? See you next week, guys. Until next time, stay curious, stay politically aware, and never mistake the system for neutral. We're better than that. Bye, guys.